Thank you very much, Dean Cooper, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's quite a privilege, actually, to have the opportunity to talk about my work in a setting that's outside of the walls of academia. So I think this is a great initiative that Dean Cooper has taken, and I'm very pleased to be a part of it. I also want to briefly thank Catherine Reeder for all of her work in putting this series together and for navigating me along and making sure that I actually got things done to be here tonight. So thank you, Catherine, for all of your work with that. The paper that I'm going to present to you, I'm going to be reading parts of it. I'll be just kind of talking more informally about parts of it. But I also need to acknowledge that this is the product of ongoing collaboration with leaders of the Indigenous Key Host Nation. And two individuals in particular are co-authors of this paper, Bertilda Alvarado Mamajacta and Gonzalo Alvarado Tanguila, who are both leaders of the Key Host movement, have been active in all phases of the preparation of the manuscript that we're in the process of finalizing right now. And so while they're not here in person, they're here in spirit, at least in the presentation of the paper. I'm going to start off by reading a little bit, and then I'll step back and give some context, some broader context for the paper as well. Okay. And since I'm getting old, I have to switch between taking my glasses on and off in order to do these things. In May of 2013, members and invited dignitaries gathered in the covered basketball court in the community of Hondachi, located in Napo province of Ecuador's Upper Amazon, for the first Congress of the Key Host Nation. After several years of organizing and a long application process, the Key Host Nation, or the Nación Originaria Quijos NAOQUI, was officially recognized by Ecuador's National Indigenous Confederation, CONAI, the Amazonian Indigenous Confederation, CONFENIAI, and by the Ecuadorian government's Development Council of the Indigenous Nationalities and Peoples of Ecuador, CODEMPE, making it the 15th officially recognized indigenous nation in Ecuador, to go along with another 18 formally recognized indigenous peoples. Reflecting the significance of the first Congress for the formal consolidation of the Key Host Nation, guests in attendance included the president of CONFENIAI, the Amazonian Regional Confederation, the president of the Amazonian Regional Confederation of Quichua Peoples, CONAQUIN, the president of the Amazonian Parliament, a representative from the Guarani Indigenous Nation, and a representative from the Ministry of Intercultural and Bilingual Education. While the central purpose of the Congress was to officially inaugurate the nation by electing officials, also prominent on the agenda was a discussion of the proposal to establish an indigenous Key Host territory under provisions granted in the latest Ecuadorian constitution. Under the new constitution, which was ratified in 2008, making it the country's 20th, indigenous peoples, Afro-Ecuadorians, and Montubios, Montubios are a kind of a coastal peasant group that are thought to have distinctive historical and cultural traits separating them from other peasants of the coast and of the highlands. So indigenous peoples, Afro-Ecuadorians, and Montubios were granted the right to request that their territories be recognized as indigenous circumscribed territories, or CTIs. While the accompanying CTI law has not yet been written, making the CTIs unoperational to date, they are intended to function as an administrative unit comparable to a municipality or rural parish, and they would be granted an operational budget by the Ecuadorian state in line with these comparable administrative units. For the Key Host people, however, what was enticing about the prospect of establishing a CTI in their territory is the enhanced legitimacy the recognition of their ancestral territory would bring to their movement, and the degree of decision-making autonomy they felt it would provide them within their territorial limits. The representatives present at the Congress ultimately approved a motion to establish the Key Host territory as a CTI, a process that is still ongoing at present. In this paper, we examine what the creation of this new form of autonomous territorial space may represent in terms of state-indigenous relations in post-neoliberal Ecuador, as part of a broader set of rights granted under the new constitution that promotes respect for cultural diversity and reinforces a commitment to the recognition of communal territories for minority populations. CTIs also appear to extend the process of state decentralization that began in the early 1990s, this time through the recognition of indigenous forms of leadership and governance. The CTIs are a component of alternative development models formalized in the Constitution through Sumac Causai, which is in Quichua, or El Buen Vivir in Spanish, or the good life, pursuit of the good life in English, a commitment to providing an ethnically diverse population with the means to pursue culturally appropriate models of development rooted in economic and environmental sustainability. As such, on the surface, the CTIs, Sumak Kausai, and the accompanying rights of nature, which are also enshrined in the latest constitution, seem to provide a reversal of a modernist state historically dependent on extractive development. In Ecuador, the most important export for the Ecuadorian economy for a long time, since the late 1960s, early 1970s, has been oil. And they continue to be reliant on oil exports for the solvency of their economy. Yet while Rafael Correa was elected as president in 2006 with broad-based support from indigenous peoples, and indigenous leaders saw the 2008 Constitutional Assembly as a key opportunity to formalize indigenous rights, the vocally anti-neoliberal Correa and his citizens' revolution has been selective in the application of the principles of Sumak Kausai. While Sumak Kausai is intended to promote sustainable development, emerging out of culturally appropriate models of economic development that ideally should be in concert with the rights of nature, Correa, at the same time, has aggressively pursued the expansion of the mining sector and extractive development more generally. In fact, this has been a common trait of the anti-neoliberal or post-neoliberal governments of Ecuador, of Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, and Bolivia under Evo Morales, where heightened social sector spending of these states is sustained by extractive industry. As the anthropologist Carmen Martinez Novo suggests, this has increasingly positioned indigenous groups in opposition to the government, as the expansion of mining activities has disproportionately occurred on indigenous lands. Furthermore, the Correa government has attempted to marginalize indigenous leaders and environmental NGOs in their opposition to extractive development by portraying them as radical environmentalists and on occasion as environmental terrorists and opponents of Correa's citizens' revolution. And the government has employed an increasingly authoritarian measure to control dissent. In this context, we question to what extent CTIs may provide indigenous peoples with a pathway to autonomous social and economic development. We suggest instead that CTIs may serve state interests by promoting the increased incursion of dominant models of economic development within indigenous territories, while also facilitating the expansion of the mining sector in and around those territories. We draw from Veronica Davidov's discussion of resource environments as loci where issues of environmental governance, environmental change, and environmental valuations are negotiated among diverse actors. She examines the case of Intag, Ecuador, which is in the northwestern Andes of Ecuador, where plans for open-pit copper mining, first by multinational corporations and now by the state mining company, have been met by sustained resistance from local inhabitants. As she argues, the construction of Intag as place is defined by its association to a particular set of natural resources, where the state focuses its attention on the rich copper deposits and local residents draw attention to its unique biosphere. In a similar vein, the Amazon is defined by its rich hydrocarbon deposits and by its biodiversity. But in the case of the Amazon, the Ecuadorian state employs both formulations simultaneously in its construction of the Amazon as place. As such, ecotourism and hydrocarbon development occur side by side in Ecuador's development imaginary, with implications for how the state envisions the relationships between people, territories, and resources. The CTIs may be part of a political program for pursuing these seemingly contradictory policies towards nature. They also help to reveal how conservation and the value of nature through its preservation hinge on the threat of or its actual destruction, as made poignantly clear by Correa's demand to be compensated by the international community to keep oil beneath the Yasuni National Park in the ground. And this has actually been a bit of a moving target. So in 2010, Correa made this announcement that he would agree to keep the oil the oil reserves the subsurface oil that is found in Yasuni National Park in the ground if the international community would compensate Ecuador with a sum of over $13 billion in compensation, which he estimated was about 50% of the value of the oil that was in the ground. The international community has come up with something like $13 million to date. And so earlier this year, Correa actually lifted the moratorium on drilling. He's granted Yasuni National Park to the Ecuadorian State Oil Company, and they're set to commence drilling in 2016. Yasuni is one of the most biodiverse regions of the world, of the entire planet. So this represents actually quite a catastrophic loss if the government goes forward with this move. Okay. As we discuss further below, the application procedure for recognition as a CTI, which includes a detailed outline of economic resources within that territory, and the formulation of a development model, may serve to forge a relationship among territory, resources, and economic production within Indigenous communities that can be incorporated into state designs for regional economic development. This, in turn, may serve the interests of state incursion into those spaces by making regions of the country with patchy state presence more legible to the central state. Further, we suggest that the granting of delimited spaces for the exercise of autonomous Indigenous governance may facilitate the political ends of an extractivist state by delimiting the territories in which Indigenous peoples may legitimately contest the exploitation of natural resources, rendering areas that fall outside of CTIs more available for hydrocarbon and other forms of extractive development, or providing the governing bodies of a particular CTI with the authority to approve forms of extractive development within their territories that would have environmental impacts that reach far beyond their boundaries. Okay, with that introduction in place, I want to step back a little bit and provide a little bit of the historical context. And really, what I'm going to be doing is talking about changes that have occurred in the last 50 years or so in Ecuador that have had implications for the Amazon region, and particularly for Indigenous peoples residing in the Amazon. So just to orient ourselves geographically, Ecuador, as I'm sure you all know, but it's always good to put a map up, it's located in northern South America, and I'm going to be speaking specifically of the Amazon territory, which is the eastern third of Ecuador. I'm in particular going to be focused on Napo province. Tacna is the capital of Napo province, but I'm going to be focused on a region in kind of the central part of Napo province, which is now home to the Quijos Nation. I want to talk a little bit about the Quijos Nation. So the Quijos Nation is the newest formally recognized Indigenous nationality, and it gained formal status in 2012. It really represents a separation of a group of about 9,000 individuals from the much larger Indigenous Quechua nation of the Amazon, which numbers in around 80,000 inhabitants. And so this is a small group that suggests that they have cultural and historical distinctiveness from other Quechua speakers of the Ecuadorian Amazon. In particular, the Quijos trace their ancestry back to pre-Columbian Quijos chiefdoms that were documented by the Spanish when the Spanish conquered when the Spanish entered into the Ecuadorian Amazon in the mid 16th century. At that time, the Spanish set up small towns in the Quijos territory, and by 1570 or so, relationships between the Quijos and the Spanish had become relatively tense. In 1578, the Quijos staged an uprising, which was ultimately repressed, leading to the death of the leader of that revolt, Cacique Humandi, and the violent repression of the Quijos more generally. And so in the ensuing decades then, the Quijos fled the territory in the Piedmont of the Andes and in this region of what is now Napo province, deeper into the Amazon, where they gradually transculturated with other indigenous groups in the Amazon. And so the group of individuals who now form the Quijos Nation suggests that they possess historical ties with the pre-Columbian Quijos population. The Cacique Humandi is kind of the central figure of the Quijos people. And in fact, it's a very useful and poignant figure for them, because Cacique Humandi has also become a symbol of the Ecuadorian nation as well. And so it gives them a kind of prominence that other indigenous groups perhaps don't have. In 2011, Cacique Humandi was declared a national hero by the National Assembly for his role in leading the 16th century rebellion. Okay. The steps that were in place in recent years and that led to the formation of the Quijos Nation have been going on in different ways in the Ecuadorian Amazon since the late 1960s. And so really we can trace back some of the indigenous organizing of the present back to some of these earlier forms of indigenous organizing in the 1960s and 1970s. And the economic context for the emergence of indigenous organizations in the 1960s and 1970s is actually really important for our present story. So there were two key events that triggered the rapid incorporation of the Ecuadorian Amazon into the Ecuadorian state, triggered radical changes for indigenous peoples residing in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and led very directly, in fact, to the formation of indigenous political organizations to defend the cultural and economic and political rights of indigenous peoples. And the first one of these things, I have them all listed here together, but the first one of these things is agrarian reform. In 1964, Ecuador passed the first of what would be two agrarian reform laws. And the idea behind agrarian reform in Ecuador was to help to deal with issues of land distribution in the highlands, where over 99% of the land was concentrated in the hands of 1% of the population. And so you had this massive, essentially landless or marginally landed peasant class, indigenous peasant class residing in the highlands. What the agrarian reform law actually did in practice, and the second part of the title of the law is instructive because it was called the Law of Agrarian Reform and Colonization. Right? What the agrarian reform law actually did in practice was it prompted peasants from the highlands to flood into the Amazon in search of land that they could cultivate, and the government actually promoted this as a strategy for addressing land inequities in the highlands. The key to making this possible was that accompanying the law of agrarian reform was a law of the fallows as well. And any land that was not being used for productive purposes, any land that was not being put towards market-oriented production, was considered uninhabited, according to this law. All indigenous people residing in the Amazon in the 1960s subsisted on small-scale horticulture, hunting, and gathering, none of which qualified for formal recognition of their territories under the agrarian reform law. So the implication of this was that all of the land in the Amazon was open to colonization, and all of the land in the Amazon was considered uninhabited in spite of the existence of tens of thousands of indigenous people residing on those lands. The second part of this story, the discovery of oil in 1967, is perhaps even more important for the kinds of transformations that occurred in the Amazon in the 1960s and 1970s. Texaco discovered oil in a place that they called Lago Agrio, which is just the Spanish translation of Sour Lake, which is where Texaco discovered oil in Texas. So, there's this connection between Lago Agrio, Ecuador, and Sour Lake, Texas. But one of the first things that they did was they began building roads in order to gain access to what would be the oil-developing region of Ecuador. Roads serve as essentially arteries for colonization. And so they facilitate the movement of people into the Amazon. And what began happening very quickly and extremely rapidly was that peasants would follow these roads that oil companies were opening up, would settle on each side of the road, would claim 50 or 100 hectare parcels of land as their own. This prompted a reaction, a response by indigenous inhabitants as they quickly recognized that they were going to lose access to their lands. And so they similarly began nucleating, forming nuclear settlements on the sides of these main roads. And they also appealed to the Land Reform Agency for title to their lands, with quite considerable success, actually. By the 1970s, and I'll back up a little bit, the region that I'm talking about that's most affected by this is what is now called Sucumbíos, Orellana, and Napo. At this time, it was in the 1960s and 1970s, it was actually all Napo, but they've subsequently divided it into various provinces. These three provinces are the provinces that actually have a substantial network of roads, and it's kind of the hotbed of oil development. Oil development is also spreading into the southern Amazonian provinces, but not as quickly, and the infrastructure doesn't exist to develop it in exactly the same way. By the 1970s, indigenous organizations were also emerging, particularly in Napo province and in the city of Tena. And so the first of the of the indigenous federations, and the federation that I've been working with since the mid-1990s, formed in 1969, the first of the ones in the northern half of the Amazon, I should say, because in 1964, the indigenous Shuar people formed a federation in Morona, Santiago. But in 1969, the Federation of Indigenous Organizations of Napo was formed. And the primary purpose of FOIN in its initial years was to assist its member communities in gaining legal title to their land. And so by the end of the 1970s and moving into the 1980s, most of all of the members of FOIN had legal title to their land, and many of these communities actually had massive territorial expanses. So they very creatively used an antiquated law that was on the Ecuadorian books called the Law of the Commons, which allowed indigenous people to be granted title to their land globally rather than individually. And so, communities gained title as a collective rather than as a group of individuals. And so the community of Hondachi, where my two co-authors are from, for example, has about 10,000 hectares of land is their territory. There are other communities who have even more. The community of Rukuyakta, which is the largest community in Napo province, indigenous community, has about 50,000 hectares of land under global titles. These are massive territorial expanses, actually. But the condition to gain title to the land was economic transformation. Because if, according to the law of the fallows, if land that was not put to productive purpose was considered uninhabited, then indigenous people had to transform their economic livelihood strategies in order to be eligible for title to land. And so almost all of them in the 1970s switched to cattle ranching and actually contributed to deforestation through the expansion of the cattle frontier as a condition to gain title to their land. By the 1980s then, we have a picture of massive deforestation, of continued colonization, of indigenous peoples having transformed their livelihoods to one where they're now economically dependent on cattle ranching and on some cash cropping, coffee, cacao. They grow naranjilla, which is kind of a bitter fruit that is used to make juice primarily. It's called lulu in other places, lulu or naranjilla. Those are the main kind of cash crops that they grow. And by the 1980s, we also see then increasing international concern and awareness around Amazonian deforestation. Right? It's in this context that ecologists, that biologists, that environmentalists, that human rights organizations are beginning to contemplate different kinds of strategies for preserving the Amazon. And the strategy that emerged as a dominant one by the 1980s was to work in concert with indigenous peoples to preserve Amazonian forest. And the argument was that you could resolve issues related to human rights, issues related to cultural continuity or cultural preservation of indigenous peoples, and forest conservation by working with the local inhabitants. This was based on, a set of understandings and expectations of the nature of indigenous people that relied on what we commonly refer to in anthropology and in the social sciences as the ecologically noble savage. The idea that indigenous peoples are inherently environmentalists and inherently live in environmental harmony with the land. And so the argument went that they would be the ideal collaborators in projects of Amazonian conservation. Because they have this tendency to live in harmony with the environment. This was largely a misreading of the reality of indigenous peoples in the Amazon. And I want to be very clear here because this is actually a tricky point. Indigenous peoples around the world do in fact have a special and oftentimes sacred relationship with the land. Right? And so I'm not in any way suggesting that this does not exist for indigenous peoples. But the mistake is a mistake of translation. And the mistake of translation that has regularly occurred is that Western environmentalists have assumed that indigenous peoples are environmentalists in the same way that they are, which generally is not the case. Right? So a special relationship in the land does not mean that it is a relationship with the land that is equivalent to that of Western environmentalists. Okay? there's a second component of this, and that has to do with with economic disenfranchisement and economic necessity. Indigenous peoples in the Amazon remain the most marginal members of that society in economic terms. While they can meet their subsistence needs quite effectively if they have access to land, what they cannot do is provide for their children's education, buy store-bought goods that they might need, deal with medical emergencies effectively. These are the things that create tremendous economic strain. And so, in fact, Amazonian indigenous peoples rely on income earned from cattle ranching and from cash cropping as an important part of their livelihood strategy. Right? So they were not about to return to the forest and return to small-scale horticulture and hunting and gathering as their primary means of economic sustenance. It simply was not something that was available to them. Okay? What's important about this is that there are certain kind of common sense constructions of indigeneity that circulate globally and that are held by some members of non-governmental organizations, some members of the environmental community. Anthropologists sometimes hold these understandings of indigenous peoples. But they frame kind of an ideal indigenous subject, and they create expectations for how indigenous peoples are kind of supposed to behave, that they're supposed to behave in harmony with the environment, that they're supposed to engage in certain kinds of cultural practices that are in concert with environmental preservation. Okay. The local reality is oftentimes quite a bit different from those idealized readings. Thank you, Catherine. That's very nice of you. Thank you. But the Correa government, to a large extent, is also building off of those very same assumptions about indigenous peoples, that indigenous peoples are natural environmentalists. And so the formation of the CTIs, and I'm going to kind of go back to reading a little bit now, the formation of the CTIs in Ecuador's 2008 constitution follows some of these earlier trends in designating indigenous territories and emerges partly out of the continued demands of by indigenous people for recognition of their territorial rights and the assumption that indigenous peoples are going to be environmental stewards of that land. As such, it's also rooted in what have become common sense understandings of the association between indigenous peoples and conservation, as the CTIs echo the eco-governmentality of earlier decades by highlighting the unique relationship indigenous peoples share with their natural world. These are pillars of summa causai, of this ideology of living the good life that's enshrined in Ecuador's constitution. And these also situate cultural revitalization for indigenous peoples as dependent upon strengthening the relationship between themselves and the natural environment. The key host nation's application for a CTI outlines one of the principal motivations as being to guarantee the conservation of biodiversity, a necessary component of addressing the cultural crisis facing their people. Through environmental sustainability, leaders argue, they will be able to resolve many of the contemporary challenges they face in terms of food sovereignty and traditional management of gardens, the interpretation of dreams facilitated by a relationship with nature, medicinal practices that rely on garden and forest products, the production of traditional artisan crafts made from naturally available materials, traditional hunting and fishing, and ecotourism as a sustainable economic alternative. The CTIs depart from prior forms of recognizing indigenous territories in Ecuador, however, because they're intended to function as local, autonomous, decentralized governments, equivalent to parish governments in administrative responsibilities. This essentially would make the CTIs autonomous agents of local development, marking the significance of the link between CTIs and summa causai as establishing a vision for alternative development in indigenous communities. Yet the extent to which residents of CTIs would possess sovereignty over their development decisions is unclear, particularly since the Ecuadorian state retains its control over subsurface mineral resources and has accelerated extractive development under the Correa government. Instead, it is possible that CTIs may facilitate increased state presence and control in indigenous territories while granting a degree of political and economic autonomy to their residents. And what I'm going to do in the last section of this talk then is talk in greater detail about the CTIs and position the CTIs in the context of the two visions the Ecuadorian state has for Amazonian development. One is ecotourism and ethnotourism, which is the second most important economic activity in the Amazon and the third most important economic activity for Ecuador, and hydrocarbon development, which again is its most important activity. And what I'm going to be suggesting is that I think that the CTIs actually facilitate the acceleration of both of these contradictory principles, ecotourism and ethnotourism and extractive development at the same time. Oh, I meant to show this earlier, but this is a picture of the Trans-Ecuadorian pipeline, which runs all the way from the Amazon to the coast, exporting heavy-grade crude I'm actually exporting light-grade crude. There's a second one that runs parallel to it that exports heavy-grade crude as well. And you can see, if you look at the photo behind it, this is the main road that runs from Quito all the way into the oil-producing region of the Amazon, and you can see the deforestation on the side of the highway, of course. And this follows the entire path of the highway into the Amazon. So the Key Host Nation began their application process in 2013 for the CTI, and the application is actually a pretty arduous bureaucratic process. It involves compiling certain types of results, submitting all kinds of paperwork, getting a whole set of approvals. But most important for what we're going to be talking about today, one of the requirements is to produce a plan de vida, which is basically an economic development plan. And so the leaders of the Key Host Nation worked on the plan de vida, or the economic development plan, by cataloging the principal actual and potential economic activities within the proposed territory and the natural resources that exist there that can be used to expand economic development, primarily through things that are in harmony with the principles of Summa Causai. In the document that was produced by NAOQUI and by the Key Host Nation, Gonzalo Alvarado, my co-author, was actually responsible for producing this document. The plan delineated rivers, lakes, and the forest as potential sources of ecotourism, while also providing the foundation for the maintenance of cultural practices through the management of biodiversity and the recuperation of traditional horticultural practices. By conceptualizing the plan de vida narrowly along the lines of sustainable natural resource use through tourism, agriculture, and biodiversity management, the Key Host Nation's vision for the CTI echoes state goals for developing the tourist potential of the Amazon, while also matching common sense constructions of indigeneity that link indigenous peoples to sustainable development and environmental stewardship. The Ministry of Tourism since 2010 has attempted to organize the tourist economy in Ecuador into a set of routes, or kind of regional destinations, oriented around particular typological features. So for the southern Andean region, for example, it has established the Ruta del Inca, or the route of the Inca, and for the coast, they have established the route of the sun. The Amazon is marketed by the ministry as the Ruta del Agua, or the route of water, drawing attention to the dense network of rivers as popular destinations for kayaking and rafting. Further, looking forward to 2020, the economic plan for the Amazon region outlined in the Agenda for the Productive Transformation of the Amazon prioritizes sustainable agriculture, ecotourism, and biodiversity management as the three main axes of economic development. The Ruta del Agua, or the route of water, is linked to Summa Causai in a superficial way through its translation into Quechua as Yacuñambi, and the accompanying suggestion in the Ministry of Tourism press release is that the name signifies the sacred nature of water for indigenous peoples. This convergence between the mandate that applications for CTIs catalog natural resource potential and state goals for developing the ecotourism potential of the region imposes a particular notion of the value of nature rooted in market principles, rendering the natural world as composed of resources available for different forms of exploitation. Thus, while the CTIs ostensibly provide the opportunity for autonomous administration of indigenous territories, they encourage particular forms of economic practices that align with the principles of Summa Causai and that facilitate state attempts to extend its economic development agenda within those territories. As noted by the anthropologist anthropologist Astrid Ulloa for the case of Santa Marta de Colombia, ethno and ecotourism, and more generally the marketing of indigenous cultural products, may represent a challenge to indigenous organizational autonomy by framing permissible indigenous cultural and economic practices as those legible to state authorities, while also conveying the image of an idealized indigenous subject rooted in environmental stewardship as the marketing face of these economic development initiatives. Following cultural geographers Tom Perot and Barbara Green, who encourage us to question what political work indigeneity is made to do in different contexts, we suggest that the CTIs in Sumak Kakausai produce a form of indigeneity that is palatable to the global community by emphasizing harmonious relationships with the natural world, while making indigenous peoples and their forest landscape available for economic development under the state's rubric for the formation of regional eco and ethnotourism programs. It also assists in the construction of one of the two competing images of the Amazon promoted by the Ecuadorian state, as a region of rich cultural and biodiversity that can be transformed into capital through tourism. So that's kind of part one of the state's vision. Part two of the state's vision has to do with linking that to extractive development. So while the ethno and ecotourist routes promote environmental conservation, the value of such protected status is predicated on the threat of its actual destruction. This is something I mentioned in the introduction as well. Environmental conservation has no value outside of its risk of destruction or termination, and so you need to have these two possibilities kind of side by side. The threat of its destruction actually produces the value of its preservation and promotes then eco-tourist practices. The selective application of the principles of Sumak Kakausai help to facilitate the pursuit of extractive development in other contexts. Although the principles of Sumak Kakausai as outlined in the Constitution make them, in theory, rights that are accessible to all Ecuadorians, the pursuit of the good life is a model of multicultural development that does not mandate that all citizens engage in environmental stewardship. This leaves open the promotion of contradictory practices by the Ecuadorian state by promoting Sumak Kakausai and ecotourism on the one hand, while pursuing accelerated extractivism on the other hand. In the immediate aftermath of the 2008 Constitution and the enshrinement of the rights of nature and the principles of Sumak Kakausai, the Correa government passed a new mining law. The mining law of 2009 opened up vast new territories to mining, including in protected areas such as Yasunui National Forest that I mentioned earlier. And the law seems to run counter to articles of the Constitution that outline rights to consultation and the premises of Sumak Kakausai itself. Under the 2009 law, environmental protections are rolled back. Prospection is permitted on private and communal lands without informed consent. Anti-mining protests become criminalized. In a context in which the acceleration of extractive development in the Amazon is accompanied by an increase in conflicts over land and territory, and where indigenous organizations have, in historical and contemporary contexts, been strongly opposed to hydrocarbon activities in the Amazon, the conditions are present for the criminalization of indigenous political activism. If we situate the CTIs in this context, however, we may be able to better comprehend the contradictory policies of Correa's government towards extractivism and conservation as he juggles the economic and political motivations of expanding the extractive frontier with the establishment of the rights of citizens to pursue their own development aligned with the principles of Sumak Kakausai. The CTIs, and this is a map of the proposed territory of the CTI, which is in this area right here, corresponding roughly to the rural parish of Cotundo, although the town of Cotundo is just outside of the territorial limits of the CTI. In a few minutes, in a couple minutes, I'll be mentioning that a Canadian mining hydrocarbon company is planning oil extraction that will encompass all of the territory that falls just outside of this CTI. Yeah, it's called Ivanhoe Energy, based out of Calgary. The CTIs become privileged spaces for the pursuit of summa causa as long as the development plans are narrowly defined to align with the ecotourism objectives of the state. But the CTIs also serve as sites of containment. By making these spaces special sites for the enactment of summa causa, it frees the spaces outside of these territories for other forms of natural resource development. This allows for the Janus-based construction of the Amazon as a space defined in relation to its biodiversity and potential for sustainable development, and as a space defined in terms of its hydrocarbon reserves and its potential for expanded extractive development. The CTIs may also serve as a form of containment in terms of indigenous autonomy and political activism. On the one hand, while the CTIs provide a context for autonomous indigenous development, they do so on a scale that is increasingly local. Indigenous organizations have long been attentive to issues of economic development, be it through advocating for the recognition of their indigenous territories or through collaboration with a variety of state and NGO development agencies. From the earliest years of the formation of the indigenous organizations in Ecuador's Amazon, as I talked about earlier, they've been active in attempting to gain legal title to communities' territories. The establishment of CONEMPE, which is an organization oriented towards around the development. It's a development fund for indigenous nationalities in Ecuador, essentially, that the different indigenous organizations can tap into for local development initiatives. When this was established in 1998 and became the agency entrusted with the economic development of Ecuador's indigenous nationalities, this ultimately cemented the role of indigenous organizations as key vehicles of local development. But it also contributed to the fragmentation of these organizations as they began to see each other as they began to see themselves as competing with each other for access to these limited funds from CONEMPE. And so on the one hand, indigenous peoples continue to pursue self-development and continue to engage in resistance to extractive development in and around their territories. On the other hand, they're doing so on a scale that is increasingly local rather than regional or even national in focus. And so the fragmentation of interest and the sense of economic competition among indigenous groups for access to resources may limit the efficacy of regional collaboration in indigenous struggles. In a more direct sense, the CTIs may provide the state with a mechanism for delimiting the territory in which an indigenous group may intervene in development activities, thereby imposing spatial limitations on political demands made by indigenous peoples. If the CTIs are organs of development attached to particular spaces, as they appear to be, this may render indigenous peoples mute on development activities that fall outside of their territories, making resistance to extractive development occurring outside of established CTIs as illegitimate. This is the conundrum that the Quijos Nation faces. So they may be able to deny Ivanhoe access to their territory because they can determine the development activities that occur within a particular CTI, right? But they now may be limited in their ability to have a say on what goes on in the territories that fall outside of their territorial jurisdiction. Yeah, Brian. Well, I'll answer that question in a minute. I'm just a couple sentences from actually wrapping up. So let me wrap up, and then we can start with that question first if you want. Okay. An alternate scenario to the one that I've just laid out for the Quijos Nation is that it may grant the residents within the CTI authority to approve extractive development within their territory, even if the environmental consequences of that development may be far-reaching and may expand far beyond the boundaries of a CTI. And so the implications of that would be, say that if residents of a CTI, even this CTI, approve hydrocarbon extraction, the consequences, the implications are far-reaching of that and will affect people who may be opposed to hydrocarbon extraction in other zones as well. And so either one of those two scenarios, in a way, serves as a containment of the capacity of individuals to express their dissent to extractive development. So thus the concerns of inhabitants of neighboring territories who may feel direct and residual impacts of extractive development may be nullified. While these scenarios are hypothetical at present, because remember the CTI law has not yet been written, and so the CTIs are not yet active, they are of immediate concern to the leaders and members of the key host nation who are confronted with impending oil development at the boundaries of their territorial claims by the Calgary-based Ivanhoe Energy Corporation. Key host leaders in their CTI application are balancing their goal of achieving territorial autonomy with the immediate threats to that autonomy posed by impending hydrocarbon development. Thank you very much.
Well, we'd like to open up to questions, so I'll let you manage that.
Sure. Well, I'll go back to Brand. Yeah, thank you, Craig. I'll go back to Brandy then. Would you say the question one more time, please?
You know, like how they were living by the road
Mm-hmm.
in protest. Would they be able to do that when the other companies come?
Right. So that's what
They're not allowed to.
that's what's not clear, in part because the law hasn't actually taken effect yet. And so what this piece is mainly, when we started working on this together, Bertilda and Gonzalo, who are both leaders of the Key Host Nation, were talking to the other leaders and trying to decide, do they want to pursue the CTI and what might be the implications of it. And so we just started thinking through, what might this law represent for Indigenous peoples if it in fact were to come into place? Because on the surface, it looks like a pretty progressive law. It looks like something that provides Indigenous peoples with decision-making autonomy. It's supposed to be in concert with the rights of nature and sumac causai, but then as they've witnessed living in Ecuador, Correa's government has been strong pro-mining, and so there's this inherent contradiction between what the Constitution says and what the state is actually pursuing. Right? What we fear, and again, this is all hypothetical at this point, but what we fear is that these CTIs. I'll go back. I'm going to go to a different slide that I showed earlier. These CTIs may actually contain Indigenous protest in small spaces. If we look at some of the earlier incidents of protest to extractive development in Ecuador, it has historically been the case that Indigenous people mobilize, if not nationally, at least regionally, in protest over extractive development. And so in the early 1990s, Atlantic Richfield Company was attempting to develop oil fields in Pastaza. And the Pastaza Quichua mobilized the entire province, in essence, in protest. They engaged in a march in 1992, all the way from the rainforest to Quito, to demand territorial recognition. And the outcome of that was the recognition of 1 million hectares of land under the communal as communal land rights for the Pastaza Quichua people. But this was a product not just of local struggle and not even just a provincial struggle, because the National Confederation of Indigenous Peoples, CONAI, also supported them in their demands. Right? So what I wonder is as you start carving out smaller and smaller spaces that are spaces of Indigenous recognition, we wonder what that might mean in terms of the capacity to protest broadly if, as is the very real threat for the Key Host Nation, oil development is going to be occurring essentially surrounding the territory of their proposed CTI. And it will almost certainly have detrimental consequences for the territory within that CTI, because the environmental costs of oil extraction are far-reaching, as we all know. Right? So, I'm sorry, tell me your name again.
Ryan.
Hi, Ryan.
So following up on that, I was kind of getting the sense that maybe the ideal outcome, like if your worries are true, the ideal outcome of the oil companies to kind of create a web of land and then just place CTIs within this so that they're all kind of contained to themselves and
Yeah.
just oil land all around it.
Yeah, that might be too pessimistic of a reading, but I think the implications of that are very similar. And in fact, when I was doing my dissertation research in the late 1990s, it was in this region right here between Tena and Archidona, the Atlantic Richfield Company, again, was actually building a secondary pipeline that was going to run all the way through this territory and connect with the main pipeline that runs through Baeza. So they were running a pipeline that was actually coming from Pastaza up through here and all the way to Baeza. And what they did was exactly what you're suggesting. Even though the CTIs didn't exist at that time, they designed the pathway of the pipeline to avoid all but 2 indigenous communities. And they ran the pipeline through private land owned by colonists. And they compensated the colonists to allow them to do that. But what they were able to do was they were able to avoid indigenous peoples engaging in collective sustained protest, because they could say, look, we're not doing anything on any of your land. Right? And so they were able to nullify indigenous protest by designing a pathway of the pipeline. They said it was the most environmentally suitable pathway, although there was no scientific evidence that suggested that. It was simply a convenient pathway that allowed them to avoid crossing indigenous territories.
And the second part to a question as well then. So with this, again, if your views are true, is this kind of like a steam release on things, basically, because you're saying there's 2 contradictory principles, pursuing environmental and kind of indigenous sustainability or those rights, while also pursuing increased extraction. So the CTI is kind of like the pressure release valve, where it's like, let a bit of steam off so that people feel at least like they're being heard, and then just go ahead and do whatever you want anyway.
Yeah, interesting. I'm not sure, although the CTIs have been met with a great deal of enthusiasm. So different indigenous groups are in the process of organizing CTIs all over the country. Right? So it has been met with considerable enthusiasm. It's also instructive that it's part of an ongoing process of decentralization in Ecuador, which started in the early 1990s. So really until the onset of neoliberal reforms, and particularly in the 1990s, the Ecuadorian state was very centralized. And so pretty much all of the resources were contained at the level of Quito and the national government. And there was literally a trickle of resources that were going to municipalities and to provincial level governments. Since the 1990s, they've been attempting to invest much more in terms of resource allocation to municipalities, and then trying to make these municipalities much more transparent in the way in which they use their funds. And this is largely just an extension of that. So now you're not only are you making the CTIs, if the CTIs ever become formalized in law, you're making the CTIs like municipalities, and therefore you're investing indigenous peoples now with resources that they can use for their own development. Right? So it actually makes sense as part of a continuation of a process that's been ongoing for the better part of 30 years now, right? 20 years? No, 25 years or so now, yeah. Joe? And then Eleanor? Joe?
Yeah. I wonder, how do people appeal to any international bodies of law, like the OAS or United Nations Declaration?
In terms of the mining law in particular, I'm not sure actually, and I haven't followed exactly what's going on in the broader legal scene. Although I'm almost certain CONAI would have by now. There's a number of legal complaints ongoing within Ecuador because they suggest that the law is unconstitutional because it does violate a variety of rights like informed consent and things like that are in place elsewhere. But I don't know the extent to which there are links with the international community at this point in legal terms. But it would be good to know. Elnora?
I'm not sure if I'm confused, but I understood at one point that even though the indigenous peoples area that they have nuclear ownership of, that the government could still cause them to have to let extraction of oil underneath them.
That's right.
So is that the confusion then of just putting everybody there, that yes, they have control, but they don't, if the government really wanted to, they could ignore that they don't want it and just do it anyway?
They could, yeah. That's generally not the best strategy if you want to maintain semi-harmonious relationships with local people. And so, but there's even to the point where they have kind of like a chart of how much, like if they have to compensate a landowner for the use of his land for oil development or for any other kind of extractive development, they actually have a chart that details how much each cacao tree is worth, how much each, essentially how much each plant on the land is worth if they destroy that land. And so they actually have a system by which they would pay you out. They would buy you off of your land. That's kind of a last resort, though. And in fact, the Ecuadorian government rarely enacts that because it does lead to quite tense relationships between local people and the government. So they do try to negotiate with people. There's another side to this as well, and this actually goes back to Joe's question, but in a slightly different way. One of the things that indigenous peoples in the Amazon in particular in Ecuador have been very effective at is accessing public international opinion on issues that are going on in the Amazon. And so when Atlantic Richfield was planning to develop in Pastaza province, when they were planning on working here, there was so much international pressure on ARCO that they eventually actually pulled out. And another oil company unfortunately took over and continued the work. But at least on a temporary basis, they were able to delay, if not completely suspend, oil activities. So there's so it would look bad for the Ecuadorian government to just step in, bring the military in, force people off of their land, compensate them, a pittance for their cacao trees, and send them on their way. That would almost certainly not curry the favor of the international community. Carol?
I'm glad you made the point about Canadian oil because I had been reading in the Globe and Mail about oil companies in Ecuador, so I think we need to know that. But my question, I guess, was about, and I understand that subsurface resource rights in the CTIs are under control of the government, so it's similar to some Canadian indigenous land. And but I was interested in water, and this is maybe an arid question from someone living in arid land, but of course, for instance, here we talk about watershed protection,
right?
And so there's got to be moving water across this territory. So how are people conceptualizing that? Because obviously oil extraction requires water, but that would be a contested resource between the CTIs and beyond the borders. So it sort of challenges this notion around containment, right?
Yeah.
So that must be discussed in
So,
the agreements, right?
Unfortunately, it's not discussed to the extent that one would like it to be discussed. So, and typically when it's raised, it tends not to be raised by the indigenous organizations themselves as much as it's raised by, say, environmental NGOs that are doing workshops with indigenous organizations to help them think about how to present their case. Because one of the so going back to my dissertation work, one of the arguments that the Federation was encouraged to make, that it never did make, to try to halt the passage of this pipeline through its territory, was to make the argument that, okay, you're building this pipeline almost entirely on hacienda land, but this pipeline is going to be crossing fault lines. This pipeline is running through a zone that is prone to landslides, particularly in the rainy season. If you look at every other pipeline that's been built in Ecuador, there's spills all the time, and of course, the oil is just going to be carried downstream, and it will affect us, and it will affect all of the people downstream as well. They didn't make that argument, right? And that wasn't part of the bargaining. That's that the indigenous organization engaged in. It's partly a weakness of position, which goes back to a bit to Eleonora's question. It's partly a bit of organizational weakness and internal division within the organizations themselves. What oftentimes happens is that the oil companies, instead of negotiating directly with the regional representative organization, will instead start going to individual communities and negotiating with the leaders of those individual communities, buying them out, signing agreements, and then moving on. and undercutting the capacity of the federation then to negotiate on behalf of all of its member communities, right? But water would be one of the key dimensions that they could use as I guess a bargaining point, or at least a point of contestation. But in general, they haven't made that argument.
And create more delocalized potential for resistance.
Exactly.
Is what you're suggesting is needed.
Exactly.
Because it would cross multiple territories.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right, Carol. Kurt?
So you talk about the CTIs being kind of a collective organization within a group of people. Is there, I guess, any room for individuals, or like, because you were talking about how they will go in and talk to individual communities, is there any real room within that system for oil companies to approach like specific landholders or groups within that community to develop on their land, or is it totally controlled by sort of the collective?
So this would be for the context of the CTI or more generally? Because the CTI really isn't active yet, so. Okay. Right, okay. Since the CTI really isn't operational yet, it's hard to answer that question, but I can talk about it in terms, what I think would happen anyway. In indigenous communities, where they all have communal land rights, which goes back to the formation of the nucleated communities in the 1970s, it is not possible for anyone to negotiate with an individual. There has to be agreement by the entire community for example, for a parcel of land to be sold. Even if you have usufruct rights to that land, it's kind of your land, right? So you're the one who has your garden there. It's recognized by everyone as your land. You can't sell that land without the right of all of the comuneros, without the right of every socio or every member, a formal member of the community, right? And that would be the same for oil development as well, or any other kind of development initiative. The entire community has to agree and sign off on something for it to be a possibility. What would probably happen with the CTI is the CTI would be composed of several different communities that fall within that territory. Each one of those communities has legal title to its own land. I don't know if the CTI would have decision-making power over the entire territory, or if it would still fall to the different individual communities to make their decisions. Brett?
I find it interesting that when you watch Ivanhoe promotional videos, they emphasize extending transportation and stuff to surrounding areas.
Yeah.
So how do you foresee this affecting the formation of these CTIs? Because the individual choice to say, oh, although my CTI doesn't support oil, I'm just going to go travel to go work in the oil there to gain the monetary.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the really interesting contradictions of oil development, and it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, recognizing the economic needs of indigenous peoples as well. So it is not at all uncommon for indigenous peoples to go and work in the oil fields for an extended period of time and then come back and protest oil development a week later, right? These are not considered necessarily as incompatible kinds of practices because of the economic needs of people. So you're exactly right. I mean, you could live in a CTI that is opposed to oil development, but at least make part of your livelihood out of working for oil companies. Yeah. Brandy?
Okay, I have two questions. I wanted to know, like, they're just all over the place, the indigenous people, or are they on reserves or what?
Right. So it's a very different history. And it depends on what part of Ecuador you're talking about. But there's no... Right.
Like on our reserve, we have communities.
Right.
But we're all in one big group.
It's different for different parts of the country. So I'll talk about the Amazon first, and if you want, I can talk briefly about the highlands as well. Okay.
Like what's all going on, is it going to be forever, or like, there's no set time for it to keep on?
For the oil development?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So for the oil development, the way the Ecuadorian government works as far as oil development is that they carve out the Amazon, or they have carved out the Amazon into blocks. And I don't have the map here of the blocks, but there are basically blocks carved out everywhere. And so pretty much the entire Amazon has been carved out into blocks that international oil companies then make bids to develop. And if they win the bid, they have the right to develop that, that oil field for 30 years. Right? So it's essentially a 30-year lease. And during that time, then the Ecuadorian government pays back the investment that the oil companies make by giving them, I think the current going rate is something like $35 or $38 a barrel that the Ecuadorian government makes will return to the oil company over that 30-year period. Right? And then the oil company, so the oil company gets its money, its investment money back for developing. The people get money indirectly through, indirectly through employment, and then indirectly through social services that are generated by the income that the country generates off of oil development. That's unclear at this point. Yeah, that's unclear at this point. Now, your first question, there are indigenous peoples in the entire Amazon. There are 8 different nationalities of indigenous peoples who reside in the Amazon. Prior to the 1960s, they all lived in dispersed settlements. So there really wasn't anything like nucleated communities prior to the 1960s. They lived in kin-based units, and they would live kind of dotted across the landscape, and they engaged in hunting and gathering primarily. Right? And they were sometimes semi-nomadic is probably too strong, but they engaged in what's called shifting cultivation. So they would plant a garden for a few years in one place. As soil fertility dropped, they would pick up and they would move somewhere else.
And so now they can't do that.
Now they can't do that. That's exactly right. Yeah. Gardening return. Yeah, because returns from gardens go down. The Amazonian soil doesn't support annual crop cycles in the same way that you can with more fertile soils, and so it's better to be able to allow land to fallow for a period of time before using it again.
So if they left and they didn't do nothing about it, the companies would have taken over? There'd be nobody to organize?
Yeah, I mean the state's vision for developing the Amazon if you look at the map, they basically have the entire Amazonian region carved out into different blocks that are eligible for. They don't open up all the blocks at once, so they're opened up gradually, right? And so they'll have bidding rounds where they'll open up, say, 4 or 5 blocks for bids from international corporations. And so gradually the oil frontier is expanding to encompass especially the northern half of the Amazon, and increasingly they're moving south as well. Yeah, Perry.
What are the criteria used to justify the case for creating a traditional use?
You first have to be recognized as either indigenous peoples or Afro-Ecuadorians or Montubios. So you have to be a member of one of those 3 groups. And then, yes, you have to be able to make a claim to an ancestral territory. So there has to be a way in which you can link yourselves back to an ancestral territory, which is what the Quijos Nation did by linking themselves back to Cacique Humande and the pre-Columbian Quijos chiefdoms, even though the center of the Quijos chiefdom is north of the CTI that they're proposing, right? But the territory that they're proposing as their CTA falls within that ancestral territory.
So it's not necessarily a matter of continual occupation, it's traditional occupation?
Both, I think. Yeah, although again, a lot of this is not entirely clear because it hasn't been made operational yet, but you have to be able to demonstrate a historical tie to land as well as continual use of the land. So I think it would be both of those things.
What about
Yeah.
where they do their ceremonies?
They don't have ceremonies in the same way that First Nations here do. They have certain kinds of ritual activities, but they're much more kind of domestic in nature, kind of nuclear family type stuff rather than being whole communities. So they have community celebrations, but they're like parties, kind of. Yeah, they throw parties for Mother's Day and things like that. Hillary?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It hasn't entirely diminished, and it depends a little bit on the region. Some of the indigenous organizations are much more militant than others are. As you move further south, they're actually much more militant. So Pastaza and Morona Santiago have indigenous organizations that are quite strong, quite militant, that have engaged in violent clashes with the military. People have been killed by the military in protest. I think, though, that, and this is one of the contradictions, I think, of indigenous organizing in Ecuador since the 1980s. One of the things that the indigenous movement has dedicated itself to, particularly since the late 1980s and through the 1990s and the 2000s, has been this issue of national recognition and cultural rights. And they've been their platform has been one that has been strongly focused on protecting the cultural rights, the linguistic rights of indigenous peoples, and of gaining official status as nations under the Constitution. And those things, and I'm not suggesting that those things are unimportant, but I think that the leaders of indigenous movements have put their energy on that and have turned their attention away a little bit from kind of the class-based struggle that was at work in the 1970s. Even though there were indigenous organizations that I mentioned briefly here functioning in the 1970s, they were being mobilized by classist organizations, right? And so they were being instilled with that kind of militant spirit of class-based organizations, which dwindled in the 1980s and particularly in the 1990s as they shifted more towards the pursuit of cultural rights, and then on top of that also the pursuit of sustainable development activities, right? So they became focused on grassroots development, kind of at the expense of paying attention to or maintaining that kind of militant stance towards extractive development. So I do think there's something quite a bit different going on now than what was going on 40 years ago. Yeah, Mike.
Hot war and a cold war.
Yeah, yeah. Michael and then Lucia.
I'm just wondering, the bits of the paper that you read,
Mm-hmm.
more about the possible vulnerabilities of having a CPI. Are you also then considering possible vulnerabilities of not having one?
Yeah, I mean that would be status quo, right? So, what worries my co-authors and I the most about the CTI is the way in which the granting of territory can actually tie your hands in terms of where and how you can engage in protest and dissent, right? And so that's primarily what we're concerned with. And of course, it's hypothetical, but in the moments, and again, this is, I mean, answering Hillary's question, I've kind of hinted at the way in which resistance is pretty fragmented in parts of the northern Amazon, not in all of it, but not so much in the southern Amazon. And in the southern part of the Amazon, people do mobilize collectively, and there's widespread broad-based mobilizations. I wonder what would happen if they were carved up into small CTIs, if they would be able to make that kind of, broader base, if they would be able to engage in that kind of broad-based protest.
I just worry that it might not be just the vulnerability of the status quo, because if other groups are going in the CPI, right, and you're not, they may begin to really forms of color that are not available.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And that's, I mean, I think that makes the question of the CTI something that the indigenous movement more generally should be contemplating before they make final decisions about whether or not they wish to pursue it. Because you may very well be right that those who choose not to find themselves in an even more vulnerable position than those who do. Right. So I think that's a very good point. Yeah. Lucia?
Kind of returning to your dialogue.
Are we running out of time here? Last question then, perhaps.
Kind of returning to your dialogue with Hillary, I have had a question kind of rattling around my brain. I was in Napo and Pastaza this last summer, and I was speaking with a woman who's part of Anduas in Pastaza, and I was helping someone in a public health class interview her about possible health issues coming from working in oil fields. She said, my family has worked in oil fields for a long time, and we've seen, no problems or whatever. It was very much contrary to what we see in the literature. But what I thought was really interesting was the fact, and I think this gets to the class part, maybe abandoning the class part, and this is kind of where my question comes in. So one of the things she was saying is that the leaders of the community's organization, the way she sees the oil company comes in, and then the leaders of their community say, well, you as a community member must pay to work for them, so trying to take a cut out of the fact that the oil company is there and is providing jobs. So, and maybe this class analysis gets to that, because obviously there's some sort of disconnect between leadership and some of these organizations and the bases. But is that something that you see?
Yeah, no, that's definitely the case. I mean, as Indigenous leaders are pursuing these sort of philosophical debates about their status as nations, they've actually been guilty of ignoring the everyday needs of people in the base communities to the extent then that what the oil companies will do is they'll go from community to community to hire people, and the community will come up with a list of the people that they're going to hire, and they'll send them on their merry way, kind of, which is not exactly what the Indigenous Federation leaders would prefer for them to do, because they would rather have this sort of unified front against the oil company. But it's very easy, since the everyday needs of members of these communities is oftentimes rather quite stark. They're more than happy to work as a machetero, clearing the ground for an oil company with a machete for $5 a day, for a period of 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So that's exactly right. And I think that you see then that internal fragmentation within the movement coming from that.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. That was
Thank you.
very interesting.
Thank you.